The weld was ugly, crooked, uneven, and full of bumps that looked like a hurried apprentice had made it. Foremen laughed about it, inspectors sighed at it, and fellow workers poked fun behind the man's back. But the man who made that weld, a quiet factory worker named Sam Carter, never blinked at the criticism. He wasn't a man who talked much, and he certainly wasn't one who defended himself. His only response was the same each time someone pointed out how misshapen his welds looked: a shrug, a small smile, and the same quiet phrase, "It'll hold." At the Detroit Arsenal tank plant in 1943, the Sherman tank was rolling off the assembly lines faster than coffee cups could be refilled. America needed tanks, thousands of them, and factories across the country were working day and night to keep up. The pressure was immense. Men and women who had never worked with steel suddenly found themselves responsible for the armor that would protect young soldiers from enemy fire. Every bead of metal mattered. Every joint could mean the difference between life and death. Sam Carter had been a welder for 15 years before the war even started. He had welded ships, factory machines, boiler pipes, anything made of steel, he knew how to join. But tanks were different. Tanks carried entire crews. Tanks faced shells, bullets, mines, and flames. Welding on a tank wasn't just about securing metal. It was about protecting the lives sealed inside. Sam learned that quickly, and he took it more seriously than anyone else in the factory. But he had a problem. His welds didn't look right. They worked. Tests showed they held strong, but they never passed the beauty test that welders and foremen used to judge skill. His beads weren't smooth. His lines weren't straight. Instead, they rose and dipped like small waves, uneven and rippled, as if the torch vibrated in his hand. But it didn't. He was steady. In fact, he was steady enough to do something the others weren't doing, though none of them knew it yet. On the assembly floor, the tank hulls moved down the line like giant skeletons waiting for their armor plates to be laid across their ribs. Welding teams clamped pieces into place and sealed them together with long threads of molten steel. Inspectors checked alignment, thickness, and consistency. In a war where production speed mattered nearly as much as durability, welders were encouraged to work fast. Straight lines, minimal filler, just enough penetration to pass the test. Sam didn't work fast. He worked right. Or rather, he worked the way he believed was right. He didn't like the minimal penetration technique the foreman taught. He didn't trust the straight, pretty beads that looked clean but often didn't sink deep enough into the armor plates. He had seen metal fail before. He had seen crisp, perfect welds snap under pressure. During his shipyard days, he had watched a boiler seam burst open because someone prioritized appearance over bonding. No one died that day, but Sam never forgot the sound. So he welded differently. He tilted his torch slightly differently. He slowed his travel speed just a bit. He let the molten pool sink deeper into the metal before moving on. But doing that created ripples. Little waves, imperfections, ugly ones, and because of those ugly welds, people made fun of him. But Sam wasn't welding for people. He was welding for the tank crews, boys really, who would sit only a few inches away from the steel he fused together. He pictured them every time he picked up the torch. He imagined their faces, their clumsy laughter, their letters home. He imagined their mothers. He imagined their sisters. He imagined their futures. That's why his welds weren't pretty. They weren't supposed to be. They were supposed to hold. For months, Sam welded exactly the same way, slow, careful, methodical. The assembly line bosses tried to speed him up, but he always found a way to keep his pace just slow enough to build the weld he wanted. Eventually they left him alone, as long as his units passed testing. They always did, but no one knew that Sam's welds were not only passing, they were stronger than nearly everyone else's. That truth didn't reveal itself until thousands of miles away, in a muddy field in France, under heavy German shellfire. Sergeant Lou Henderson sat inside his Sherman tank, the Iron Maiden, as German anti-tank guns hammered the American armor line. The air inside was hot, choking, ringing with tension. The crew trusted their tank. They had driven it for months, but that day, against the deadly 75mm German Pak guns, nothing felt safe. A shell slammed into the Iron Maiden's side. The tank rocked violently. Lou heard men shout over the radio. Some tanks in their unit weren't moving anymore. He smelled smoke. He coughed. But the Iron Maiden kept rolling. The shell hit again. Same spot, same side. The armor dented inward, sending shockwaves through the steel. Lou braced himself. He knew what usually came next. If the weld seam tore, the plates could crack open like a tin can. But it didn't. The tank held. A third shell hit. Same spot. A miracle or a curse. No one inside knew which. The impact tore a chunk of metal from the outer plate. The weld seam was exposed. Lou stared at it through the thin crack of light created by the damage. It was ugly. It had bumps, waves, imperfect ridges. But it held. Even under multiple direct hits from a German anti-tank gun, the weld did not fail. The plate bent, dented, warped, but the seam stayed together. The Iron Maiden limped out of the battlefield alive. Lou and his crew survived because of that single line of metal. Back in France, repair crews examined the tank. They were shocked. No Sherman hit like that was supposed to hold together. They took photographs. They wrote reports. They studied the weld line. One inspector laughed when he saw it. This looks like a trainee's first weld. But another shook his head after scratching the metal and examining its depth. No, this isn't sloppy. This is deep, real deep. Whoever welded this knew exactly what they were doing. The report traveled back to Detroit. It reached engineers, supervisors, the U.S. Army Ordnance Department, and slowly, it made its way to the welding floor where Sam Carter worked quietly at Station 14B. A section chief approached him one morning with a folder in hand. "You Carter?" he asked. Sam nodded. "This your weld?" The chief held up a photograph of the uneven, rippled seam. Sam looked at it and scratched his beard. "Looks like it," he muttered. "You know it saved an entire crew." Sam looked up slowly. "What?" The chief explained the whole story. How the weld had survived multiple hits, how engineers were trying to understand why it held, how they traced it back through factory logs to Sam's shift, Sam's station, Sam's technique. Sam didn't say anything for a long moment. He wasn't used to praise. He didn't know what to do with it. They were fine. All of them. He finally asked. "Every last one." Sam nodded softly, the corners of his eyes crinkling in relief. Engineers later studied his work more closely. They discovered that Sam's welds penetrated deeper than standard. They fused the armor plates more securely. They distributed force more evenly. And most importantly, they resisted cracking better than the cleaner, faster welds being taught widely across the industry. His technique wasn't sloppy, it was superior. The ripples, the ridges, the imperfections weren't mistakes at all. They were signs of a weld that had sunk deep and cooled slowly, creating stronger joints. When the Army realized this, they didn't just praise Sam, they quietly updated welding guidelines based on his approach. They couldn't slow down production too much, but they encouraged slightly deeper penetration, slightly slower travel, and slightly hotter weld pools on critical seams. And all of that came from one ugly weld. But the story didn't end there. Months later, the Iron Maiden crew wrote a letter addressed to the Detroit Arsenal tank plant. They wanted to thank the workers who built their tank. They didn't know who welded what, so they thanked everyone. When the letter reached the plant, someone pinned it on the bulletin board near the break room. Most workers skimmed over it, smiling for a moment before going about their day. But Sam stood in front of it for a long time. He read every word carefully. The crew talked about surviving an ambush, about making it home alive, about thinking of the workers back in Detroit who built the steel shell that protected them. They wrote about hoping those workers understood how much their craftsmanship mattered. Sam didn't cry, but his eyes were wet. One of his coworkers nudged him. "Hey, Sam, you see this? Might be talking about your ugly welds." Sam chuckled quietly. Maybe so. After the incident in France, Sam became quietly famous inside the plant. Not in a loud, applause-filled way, but in a respected, whispered way. People who had once teased him now watched his hands carefully when he worked. New welders asked him questions. Engineers took notes. And slowly, the culture shifted. Perfection wasn't defined by beauty anymore. Perfection was defined by survival. The war pressed on, and tanks continued to roll off the line. Sam never changed how he welded. He never sped up. He never tried to make the beads prettier. If anything, he dug deeper, literally and figuratively. He became the quiet guardian of the men who would one day rely on the seams he created. Some nights he stayed late, perfecting a seam that no one else would have bothered to redo. Some mornings he arrived early, wanting to get a head start before the shift horn blared. He wasn't chasing recognition. He was chasing peace of mind. He wanted every tank he touched to stand a fighting chance. And thousands of them did. Years later, after the war ended, a few members of the Iron Maiden crew visited the Detroit plant. They wanted to meet the workers who had built the tank that saved their lives. They shook hands, shared coffee, and exchanged stories. Sam stood in the back at first, unsure if he should approach. He never thought of himself as a hero. But when Lou, the tank commander, heard someone mention the guy with the ugly welds, he turned immediately. "Where is he?" Lou asked. Sam raised his hand slowly. Lou walked over without hesitation and wrapped him in a tight, emotional hug. "You saved my boys," Lou said. "You saved all of us." Sam didn't know what to say. He muttered something about just doing his job. Lou pulled back and gripped his shoulders. "Don't ever say that. Your job saved our lives." They talked for hours. The crew explained everything about that day in France. They showed Sam battle photographs. They told him about the nightmares they didn't have to live with because the tank didn't explode. They told him about their children who wouldn't exist if that weld had failed. Sam listened quietly, absorbing every word. Before the men left, Lou gave him a small plaque his crew had made. It wasn't official, it wasn't fancy, just a hand-carved piece of wood that read, "To the man whose weld held." Sam hung it above his workbench, and it stayed there for the rest of his life. As the years passed, Sam continued welding. He trained new generations of welders. He never bragged. He never boasted. He simply taught them what he had always known, that a weld shouldn't be pretty for the eye, it should be strong for the soul. Many welders who learned from him carried his techniques into new factories, shipyards, and industries. His ripple-style welds became a signature of reliability. Industrial engineers later recognized that his deeper penetration technique anticipated modern welding standards by decades. But Sam never cared about legacy. He cared about holding things together. When Sam retired, the factory held a small ceremony. Nothing grand, just workers gathering near the assembly line to thank a man who had never asked for thanks. Someone had taken the old plaque from his workbench, worn, dusty, and slightly bent, and placed it on the table next to a brand new Sherman model tank painted with the nickname Iron Maiden. The plant manager gave a short speech. Others shared memories. But the most powerful moment came when a young welder, barely 20, stepped forward. He had been trained by Sam just a year earlier. "My father fought in the war," the young man said. "He wasn't in a Sherman, but he always said that his life depended on people like you. I just want to say, thank you for teaching me how to weld right. Not fast, not pretty, right." Sam smiled, shook the young man's hand, and quietly walked out of the factory for the last time. But his welds remained behind, thousands of them, holding together metal and memories alike. Sam passed away many years later. In his home, among the simple furniture and worn tools, his family found the plaque still hanging proudly. They found letters from grateful soldiers. They found photographs of tanks he helped build. And they found a small note he had written to himself decades earlier, tucked inside a drawer. "It'll hold." That phrase became the quiet motto of welders who learned his story. Some even carved it into their toolboxes. Others repeated it softly before starting a new seam. The phrase drifted through factories and workshops, long after Sam was gone. It'll hold. In war, heroes come in many forms: soldiers, medics, commanders, codebreakers. But there are also unseen heroes, the ones whose hands never held a rifle but whose work held together the machines of war. Sam Carter was one of them. A factory worker whose welds saved lives. A man who didn't care about recognition. A man whose ugly welds were beautiful in the only way that mattered. The Iron Maiden's crew went on to live full lives: marriages, children, careers, laughter, heartbreaks, triumphs. Every one of those stories existed because a single weld seam held together under fire. And somewhere in the echo of time, in the ringing of steel being forged, in the hiss of a torch melting metal, Sam's quiet voice can still be heard. It'll hold.